Hi, welcome to One Eye on the Page. I'm Scott. This is installment number 10 in Five-Year Battle Stephen King, the years 2019 through 2023. These 5 years are the least productive of King's as far as publishing goes, including Holly, which is supposed to be published in September. He will have published 7 books. It's interesting to say 7 books in 5 years is a bit of a slowdown for King, but the lowest that I've seen before has been 8 books, which I believe he's done twice. And the most he's done has been 13 books, which was 1979 through 1983. We're going to go ahead and start. Book number 1 is The Institute. The Institute is about kids with powers, which is not an area that King has stayed away from. So if you're looking for new territory, you're not necessarily going to get it here. However, when you compare it to like Charlie McGee and Firestarter, to me, this book is much better than that. The way the story is told, we are first introduced to an adult, Tim Jameson, and spend actually quite a bit of time with him before we switch to the kids at the Institute. And it's a fairly common plot, you know, kids being used for their powers, kids being held prisoner, kids being held prisoners, kids trying to escape. But I think it's actually very well told. There are issues, of course, especially now. King is in his 70s now, writing about kids, writing kids' dialogue doesn't come across very well. When he's writing about the language of kids at the time when he was a kid in the 50s, he writes that amazingly well. It doesn't come across quite as well when he's writing kids like in the 2020s. So, I mean that is an issue that if you get hung up on, it will make the novel not as good for you. But it's not one that I particularly had an issue with. So, obviously, first book, it's going to be number 1. Okay. Next, we have If It Bleeds, which is a collection of 4 novellas, although they are of varying length. 3 of them are less than 100 pages, and one of them is like 190 pages. The one that's 190 pages is If It Bleeds, which has the character of Holly Gibney, which I've mentioned before is in the Bill Hodges trilogy and also was in The Outsider and will be in the upcoming novel Holly. It's a decent novella. It's a little bit difficult for me to really go in depth on a lot of these novellas or in short stories that have been published recently because I haven't read them as many times as I would have read previous novellas. But I think this book, the novellas, they don't reach the heights of different seasons, obviously. But, and I don't think they probably reach the heights of Four Past Midnight either. Although, again, I talked about Four Past Midnight had a couple of stories that are really high up, and the other two stories were, one was blah for me, and the other one was completely forgettable. This one, If It Bleeds, Holly Gibney, pretty decent tale. A lot of it, as I have said before with Holly, it depends on your view of Holly. Some people find her irritating. I don't, so I enjoyed it more. So I enjoyed that tale, but it wasn't like a barn burner or anything. Uh, Mr. Let's see, Mr. Harrigan's Phone is a very common, especially now, story for King, in which a young man and a much older man form a friendship, and eventually the old man dies and spooky shit happens. But often with King, the journey is worth it. You know, you again, as I was saying with the Institute, you're going to have a kid that speaks a little bit differently than kids you would be talking to now, but if you're able to get over that, it's fine. No new roads taken here, but a very enjoyable tale. Uh, in some ways, although they're not the same type of thing, it reminds me of Revival, mostly in the way it began, kind of the nostalgic thing, and then stuff happened. Much darker stuff in Revival than in Mr. Harrigan's Home, but there's some familiarity about it. If you want something that's not familiar, The Life of Chuck is something I can't even describe. I found out recently that there's going to be a movie made from this. I have no idea how that's going to happen. I enjoy it when King takes a risk and does something that he usually doesn't do, and so I enjoyed that about The Life of Chuck. The Life of Chuck. Chuck dies. How that happens, you need to read for yourself. I don't. This is one of those things, like, I don't usually mind giving spoilers, although I try to warn people if I do. But this one, just go into it without knowing what happens. Rat, it's another writer dealing with his writing. As far as that trope, it's not one of King's best. I think you have two very good stories in here, or with The Life of Chuck, even better than very good. And you have an enjoyable story in If It Bleeds. Rat is not something that I would recommend particularly. It doesn't stand out. So I'm going to rank this below the Institute. I think if Rat had been good, it might have gone above the Institute later. This is another book for the Hard Case Crime series. I honestly think of the three, Joyland was by far the most superior one. The Colorado Kid was good if unresolved. Uh, this one is pulp, and I don't usually say pulp in a negative way because pulp can be very good, but it just It's not particularly good, and it gets really weird for me. I may have only read this once because I did my Stephen King reread in 2020, and this came out in 2021. So this is one of the books that I have only read once, and unless I do a complete reread of all King's books, I don't know that this is going to be one that I'm going to read again. So I'm going to put this for right now at the very bottom of the pile. Billy Summers, another well-worn plot, not necessarily for King, but overall a hitman with a heart of gold does one final job. You're not necessarily going to be surprised by much of anything that happens in here. Maybe a few side trips and maybe like, oh, I didn't see that coming, but probably not. It like a lot of Stephen King books that don't particularly have great endings or have well-worn tropes. It relies on the journey and the characters work pretty well together. And Billy's build up to his job is well written. It's just one of those novels where it gets to a certain point and then you're just kind of like, well, I mean, I enjoyed the journey. Is the ending going to ruin it for me, or am I going to be able to overlook the ending? Not am I going to enjoy the ending, but am I going to overlook it? Because the ending is something that you've seen before. And King tries to make it seem like it's something different, but it's not. And I enjoyed the journey, but I don't know if I had known where we were going if I would have gone on a trip. Rereadability of it, I would probably read it again for how long is it? It's 500 pages. Oof. I would reread it again for like probably about 350 pages or so, and then the last 150 pages. Do you really need to? Completely up to you. I'm a great believer in section reading. I will go back to favorite books or books that I have enjoyed part of, and I will just read scenes from them. Sometimes I will reread whole books, but sometimes, as I mentioned before, like Insomnia, I will reread the book, but I will read the final chapter quite a bit often. I probably read the final chapter 5 times more than I have read the actual entire book. It's a good journey, but then you just end up in a rest stop somewhere. So it's still better than later, though. Is it better than If It Bleeds? Oh, that's a tough one. I think I'm going to put it just below If It Bleeds, but honestly, you could almost flip a coin on that one for me, and it could be either way. Gwendy's Final Task. I really enjoyed Gwendy's Button Box. I I can't remember the name of the second book right now, but it was written by Richard Chismar only, whereas the first and third books are co-written by King and Richard Chismar. The second book I didn't enjoy as much, not because of Chismar necessarily, but just the way the plot went. I left Gwendy's Button Box expecting one thing, and then the next book kind of just changed all of it. It was okay. The third one is written well, but it's just strange. And again, it's one that I've only read once. It it takes place in space, for one thing. Uh, Gwendy, who after the events of Wendy's Button Box becomes an author and then a politician, gets to basically go to space, kind of like people can with SpaceX now as a civilian. She is also there with a billionaire type person who is a Bezos or something like that. And she actually plans to get rid of her button box in space. It's just a little bit too far out there for me, maybe. Again, it's enjoyable writing. I just think when you go from the journey of Gwendy's button box to Gwendy's final task, it's just and some of the things that a lot of it reads like a thriller, not only a thriller, but like a conspiracy thriller. And that's just not what I'm looking for from King. So, again, it's still better than later, but it's just above later and under Billy Summers. Okay, the final book of 2019 to 2023 is Fairy Tale. Fairy Tale, again, going to get this out of the way because I mentioned it several times already. Has a kid in it. Kid dialogue is not what you're actually probably going to see from kids these days. And Charlie, the kid in here, is a teenager, is kind of looked upon as an old soul. So at least King is trying to say, this is why he talks like he does. But there's a fantasy land, there's a lovable dog. This is a really great book. I kind of feel like we could have spent more time in the fantasy land, which is funny to say for a book that I think, yeah, it's almost 600 pages long. There's an, a young boy and an old man relationship, friendship that happens, and then the old man dies and stuff happens. Let me know if you've heard that before. It does tread some familiar paths, but it does it very well. The ending is not darker than I expected, but maybe a little bit more pessimistic than I was expecting, but that's okay too. I don't know if King wrote it going like there's not going to be a sequel, but I still feel like there could be one. So I'm this one's going to be number one. I don't know when I'm going to publish this. Chances are it's going to be before September, so Holly will not be part of this, or if for some reason I don't publish it till then, I will add in Holly and film a new scene for the ranking and just insert it in here. But assuming not, I'm just going to go by what I got now. And if I feel like if I publish a video before Holly comes out and I feel like Holly came close to upsetting Fairy Tale, I will redo the video, but we shall see. But for right now, coming in at number 6 is Later. Coming in at number 5 is Gwendy's Final Task. Coming in at number 4 is Billy Summers. Coming in at number 3 is If It Bleeds. Coming in at number 2 is The Institute. And coming in at number 1 is Fairy Tale. Until next time, thank you for coming to One Eye on the Page, and I'll talk to you later.